The scent of grilled burgers and smoky ribs hung thick in the summer air as Alex surveyed the yard, watching family and friends mingle under strings of twinkling lights. It was a warm, lively evening, and everyone looked relaxed, laughing and sharing stories from years past. Among them, Evelyn moved with a calm elegance, her laugh bright against the soft hum of conversation. She was, as always, effortlessly captivating. He hadn't seen her in months, maybe longer. Growing up, Evelyn had been like a second mother to him, a family friend who never missed birthdays, holidays, or his soccer games. But now, as he watched her from across the lawn, there was something different about her, or maybe it was him who had changed. He felt his gaze lingering on her longer than it should, noticing the way she held herself with the kind of confidence and grace he now found captivating. She wore a simple dress that seemed to catch the light with every step, and her silver-streaked hair was pulled back, highlighting her strong, striking features. The evening wore on, the sky turning a dusky pink as the sun began to set. At one point, as he was helping bring out drinks from the kitchen, Evelyn joined him, her hand brushing his as she took a glass. She smiled, her eyes catching his with a warmth that sent a thrill down his spine. "Thank you, Alex. You always seem to be right where you're needed," she said, her tone light, but there was something lingering behind her words. He managed a small laugh, feeling the air between them grow thick, though he couldn't explain why. "It's nothing," he replied, attempting to shake off the feeling. "I'm just glad to help." But as the night continued, Alex found his attention drawn back to Evelyn, as if some invisible string kept pulling him toward her. He would catch her glancing his way, their eyes meeting in shared silence. As the BBQ continued, Alex felt the weight of Evelyn's presence in a way he hadn't before. It was subtle at first, but every time their eyes met across the lawn, a warm current seemed to pass between them. She'd smile, a gentle and familiar smile, and he'd feel his heart quicken. His thoughts began to race, drifting to things he shouldn't be thinking about. The evening started to wind down as people slowly made their way home, calling goodbyes and thanks over their shoulders. Alex was in the kitchen, rinsing plates and stacking them in the dishwasher when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned, and there was Evelyn, her face slightly flushed from laughter and a few glasses of wine, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Need a hand?" she asked, her voice light and warm. "Sure," he replied, trying to keep his tone as steady as possible. She stepped forward, taking a plate from him, and for a moment their fingers brushed. The simple touch sent an electric spark up his arm, and he couldn't help but glance at her, wondering if she felt it too. Her expression was calm, but he caught a glimmer of something in her eyes, something that made his pulse quicken. They worked together in companionable silence, occasionally bumping elbows as they moved around the small kitchen. At one point, Alex reached for a dishcloth just as Evelyn did, and their hands collided again. She laughed softly, and their eyes met once more, lingering a second too long. "I don't think I've seen you much lately," she said, her voice low as she dried a glass. "Feels like you've been busy with work or something." "Yeah," he replied, a bit too quickly, trying to focus on anything but the way her lips curved as she spoke. "Life's been busy." She nodded, her gaze fixed on him. "It's just funny how time changes things, isn't it? How people grow and change." He wasn't sure what to say to that, so he simply nodded, feeling the weight of her words. There was something in the air, an unspoken tension that neither seemed ready to address. The last guest had left, and his parents were in the backyard gathering the last of the dishes, leaving them alone in the dimly lit kitchen. Evelyn took a step closer, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air between them. "You know, I remember when you were just a little boy running around with muddy knees and skinned elbows," she said with a nostalgic smile. "Now look at you, an adult." Alex chuckled, feeling a bit flustered under her gaze. "Time really does fly, doesn't it?" She nodded, her eyes not leaving his. There was a softness in her expression, a warmth that made his breath catch. He suddenly felt like a teenager again, nervous and unsure of himself, wanting to say something, anything, to break the silence but not knowing where to start. And then, in one fluid motion, Evelyn placed her hand on his arm, a gentle touch that felt both comforting and intimate. "You know," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, "sometimes I wonder how people can be so close and yet feel like strangers." Her words hung in the air, filling the small space between them with a kind of tension he hadn't expected. He swallowed, feeling his pulse race as he looked into her eyes, searching for some indication of what she was thinking. He could see her face soften, her gaze shifting from his eyes to his lips and back again, and he felt himself leaning in almost instinctively, drawn to her in a way he couldn't explain. "Alex," she murmured, her voice trembling slightly. She hesitated as if wrestling with her own emotions. "We shouldn't." But neither of them moved away. Time seemed to slow as they stood there, inches apart, the quiet hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. Alex's heart pounded in his chest, and he could feel the warmth of her hand on his arm, steady and unyielding. Every rational thought told him to step back, to break the spell before it went too far, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. He saw her lips part slightly, her gaze still fixed on him, and he knew, in that moment, that there was no going back. He leaned forward, closing the gap between them, and their lips met in a soft, tentative kiss that felt like it had been building for a lifetime. It was gentle at first, a hesitant exploration, but as the seconds passed, it deepened, filled with a sense of longing that neither of them could deny. Evelyn's hand slid up to his shoulder, her fingers curling around his neck as she pulled him closer. Alex felt his own hands move to her waist, holding her as if she might vanish if he let go. The kiss grew more urgent, more intense, and he found himself lost in the warmth of her embrace, the softness of her touch. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing heavily, their faces flushed. Evelyn looked at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and something else, something deeper. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. I'm sorry," he managed, his voice barely a whisper. But Evelyn shook her head, a soft, understanding smile playing on her lips. "Don't be," she murmured, reaching up to brush a strand of hair from his face. It's not something we planned, but maybe it was inevitable." They stood there in silence, neither willing to break the moment, both aware that they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. And yet there was a sense of calm that settled over them, as if for the first time they were exactly where they were meant to be. Outside, the last traces of daylight faded, leaving them wrapped in the quiet intimacy of the kitchen. Evelyn placed a hand on his cheek, her thumb brushing gently over his skin, and Alex closed his eyes, savoring the warmth of her touch. He knew this was wrong, that there would be consequences, but in that moment he didn't care. All that mattered was her, standing there with him, sharing a quiet, forbidden connection that felt more real than anything he had ever known. They stayed there, suspended in that quiet space where time seemed to lose all meaning. The world outside the kitchen felt distant, like an echo, leaving only the warmth of Evelyn's hand on Alex's cheek and the lingering sensation of their kiss. He opened his eyes to find her looking at him, her expression a blend of vulnerability and wonder. I didn't think this could happen," she whispered, her voice tinged with disbelief. "All these years I've known you as that boy who always ran around with boundless energy, the one who'd tug on my sleeve, showing me every little thing you found fascinating in the world. And now—" She trailed off, her hand slipping down from his face, her fingers brushing lightly over his chest as if rediscovering him in this new light. Alex's heart pounded as he searched her gaze. "Now it feels like everything's different," he murmured. He could hardly believe the words himself, yet there was no denying the depth of his feelings. What had begun as a faint attraction, a passing admiration, had bloomed into something unexpected, intense, something that demanded to be acknowledged. Evelyn's hand moved to his, her fingers intertwining with his own. "Do you think," she hesitated, glancing toward the open window where the last traces of twilight cast a soft glow over them, "do you think we're making a mistake?" He squeezed her hand gently, feeling the weight of her uncertainty. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I do know that I've never felt this way about anyone. Not like this." They held each other's gaze, and in that moment any doubts they might have had seemed to dissolve. Evelyn's face softened as she stepped closer, her hand resting on his shoulder as she leaned into him. He felt the warmth of her breath on his neck, her closeness wrapping around him like a familiar embrace. Every inch of distance between them vanished, leaving only the pull of their connection magnetic and undeniable. Without another word, she lifted her head, her eyes filled with a depth of emotion that took his breath away. And then, as if guided by an unspoken understanding, they leaned into each other once more, their lips meeting in a kiss that was neither hesitant nor hurried. It was deep, raw, and unapologetically honest, a kiss that spoke of all the feelings they'd kept hidden, the silent longings they hadn't dared to voice. They didn't pull away this time. Instead, Alex found himself enveloped in the warmth of her embrace, his hands sliding to her waist as he held her close, savoring every moment, every sensation. He could feel her heartbeat against his chest, steady and strong, a quiet affirmation of the bond that had formed between them. Evelyn's hands moved up his back, her fingers tracing the line of his shoulder blades with a tenderness that sent shivers down his spine. She pulled back just slightly, her eyes searching his face as if memorizing every feature, every detail. Her gaze softened, and she reached up, her fingers brushing over his cheek. "There's no going back, is there?" she murmured, her voice a soft, tremulous whisper. "No," he replied, his voice filled with a certainty that surprised even him. "But I don't want to." A small, wistful smile tugged at her lips. "Neither do I." They stood there, wrapped in the quiet intimacy of the moment, each aware of the boundary they'd crossed and the impact it would have on their lives. Yet neither of them moved to break the spell. Instead, Evelyn took a step back, her hand still holding his, and guided him toward the door leading to the backyard. "Come with me," she whispered, her eyes bright with a sense of mischief that reminded him of a much younger version of herself. Together they stepped outside, leaving the warmth of the kitchen behind as they ventured into the quiet serenity of the garden. The air was cool, filled with the scent of freshly cut grass and the distant hum of crickets. Evelyn led him to a secluded spot beneath an old oak tree, its branches casting gentle shadows across the lawn. They sat down together on a small stone bench, the silence between them comfortable, almost sacred. Alex felt her hand slip into his once more, and he turned to find her watching him, her gaze soft and contemplative. "You know," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I always thought that at this point in my life I'd be settled, content." But now she looked away, her eyes drifting over the garden, a faraway look in her gaze. "Now I feel like there's so much I've yet to discover." He nodded, understanding her words in a way he hadn't expected. "Maybe it's not about settling," he replied gently. "Maybe it's about finding something, someone who makes you feel alive again." A tear slipped down her cheek, though her smile remained. "You make me feel that way, Alex. I haven't felt this way in years, not since." She stopped herself, shaking her head with a soft laugh. "I'm not sure I even know how to describe it. But it's as if a part of me that had been sleeping has finally woken up." He reached up, gently wiping the tear from her cheek, his thumb lingering on her skin. "Then let's not lose this moment," he whispered, his voice filled with a quiet intensity. "Let's just be here, together." She nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears, and as they sat there beneath the shelter of the old oak, they leaned into each other once more, their lips meeting in a kiss that felt like a promise, a vow of the connection they'd found in one another. It was tender, slow, and filled with a sense of wonder, as if they were discovering each other for the first time. Their hands intertwined, and Alex felt a warmth spread through him, filling every corner of his being. He knew that this moment would stay with him forever, a memory etched into his heart. The kiss deepened, and as they pulled each other closer, the sounds of the night faded, leaving only the soft rustle of leaves overhead and the steady rhythm of their breathing. Evelyn's hand traced gentle patterns across his back, her touch sending a warmth through him that felt almost electric. They sat there in a quiet bubble of intimacy, every soft movement and lingering touch speaking volumes they couldn't find the words for. Alex wasn't sure how long they stayed there, wrapped up in each other, savoring every small moment. At one point he felt her head rest against his shoulder, her hand still clasped in his, fingers laced tightly as if afraid to let go. He felt a profound sense of calm settle over him, a feeling that somehow this was exactly where he was meant to be. The garden around them lay in shadows, bathed in the faint silver light of the moon. Evelyn tilted her face up to him, her eyes reflecting the quiet beauty of the night, her lips parted as if on the verge of speaking. But instead of words, she reached up, placing a gentle hand on his cheek, her thumb brushing softly over his skin. "It feels surreal, doesn't it?" she murmured, a faint tremor in her voice. "Like a dream that I don't want to wake up from." He nodded, barely trusting himself to speak. "I know exactly what you mean." They sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts, yet deeply aware of the other's presence. Finally, Evelyn sighed, her fingers tracing down to his hand and holding it firmly. "I don't know what comes next," she admitted, her voice soft and uncertain. "But whatever it is, I want it to be real. I want it to mean something." Her words resonated within him, stirring something deep inside. He leaned forward, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead, and whispered, "Then let's make it real. Let's not run from this, no matter how complicated it might seem." She closed her eyes, a peaceful smile gracing her lips as she leaned into his touch. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "for giving me something I thought I'd lost a long time ago." They remained like that for what felt like hours, wrapped in each other's warmth, the world outside forgotten. Finally, Evelyn pulled back slightly, her expression soft but resolute. "Maybe we should head back inside before someone wonders where we are," she said, a gentle laugh in her voice. He smiled, feeling a pang of reluctance. "You're probably right." They stood up, fingers still entwined, and slowly made their way back to the house, the glow of the porch light illuminating the path before them. As they reached the back door, Evelyn hesitated, her hand tightening around his. She looked at him with a mixture of vulnerability and longing that sent a jolt through his chest. "Can I see you tomorrow?" she asked, her voice soft and hopeful. "Of course," he replied without hesitation. "I'll be here." A faint blush colored her cheeks, and she gave him a small nod before stepping inside, casting one last glance over her shoulder as she disappeared into the softly lit hallway. Alex stood on the porch for a few moments, staring after her, feeling a surge of emotions he couldn't quite name. He wanted to follow her, to stay by her side, but he knew that tonight had already changed everything. They both needed time to process what had happened, to understand what it meant for them. He walked back toward his car, his mind racing with thoughts of their time together, the feel of her touch, the warmth of her smile. Every step away from the house felt like pulling himself from a magnet, leaving him with a hollow ache that only grew as he drove home. The next day he couldn't shake the memory of their evening together. He replayed every detail in his mind, over and over, until he felt like he could see her in his mind as clearly as if she were standing in front of him. As evening approached, he found himself anxiously counting down the hours until he could see her again. When he finally arrived at her home, she was waiting by the front door, a soft smile lighting her face as she saw him. She stepped forward, wrapping him in a warm embrace that felt as natural as breathing, and he held her close, savoring the familiarity of her presence. They spent the evening talking, sharing stories and memories that seemed to bring them even closer. With every laugh, every glance, Alex felt his heart swell, and he knew, with absolute certainty, that he was in too deep to turn back now. As the night deepened, Evelyn reached for his hand, her fingers lacing through his, as she looked at him with a mixture of affection and apprehension. "Alex," she murmured, "I need you to know. I never planned for this. I never thought." He silenced her with a gentle kiss, brushing his lips softly against hers. "Neither did I," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "but I wouldn't change it for anything." They spent the rest of the night wrapped in each other's arms, savoring the closeness, the quiet understanding that passed between them without the need for words. It was as if they were two souls finally finding their way to each other after all the years of quiet longing and hidden affection. When morning came, they parted with a shared smile, a silent promise that this was only the beginning. Evelyn's gaze lingered on him as he stepped away, her eyes filled with a quiet warmth that left him breathless. In the days that followed, they found every excuse to be together, sharing secret moments that felt as thrilling as they were forbidden. Every glance, every touch, every stolen kiss only served to deepen the bond they shared, each encounter leaving them both longing for more. But as the weeks passed, they both knew that their secret could only remain hidden for so long. The unspoken tension, the lingering looks, it was all too easy for others to see, and soon the whispers began. Friends and family started to notice the way they looked at each other, the way they seemed to gravitate together, and Alex could feel the weight of their questions, their judgment, hanging in the air. One evening, as they sat together on her porch, Evelyn took his hand, her gaze steady and filled with resolve. "Maybe it's time we faced this," she said softly, her voice laced with a mixture of sadness and strength. "People are starting to notice, they're asking questions, and I don't want to hide anymore." He nodded, knowing she was right. "I'm with you, Evelyn. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." They braced themselves for the inevitable, for the conversations that would follow, the explanations that would need to be given. But through it all, they held on to each other, finding strength in the quiet understanding that they shared. In the end, they knew that love wasn't something that could be neatly packaged or explained. It was a force that defied logic, a connection that didn't care about convention or expectation. They were two souls drawn together by something inexplicable, something that felt as real as the ground beneath their feet. As they faced the world hand in hand, they found that the love they shared was more than enough to carry them through, a quiet, steady flame that burned bright, even in the face of doubt and uncertainty. And though they knew that there would be challenges ahead, they also knew that they had found something worth holding on to, something that would last for as long as they were willing to fight for it. They leaned into each other, sharing one last quiet moment on the porch, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together, bound by the love that had brought them together and the unbreakable bond they had forged.